So I'm Jack Brassil. I work at HP Labs here in Princeton. This is some work I've done with a number of my colleagues who are actually here also in Princeton. So what I'm going to talk about are, I think, three things that I think each are all sort of independently interesting. Femtocells, I'm kind of, in the long term, really optimistic about small cells and how we will need to go with small cells to do space division multiplexing to get bandwidth that we'll need for our ever-growing needs. Location services, which I just find fascinating and cool, and we're talking about lots of the privacy implications over lunch. And the last thing is cheating. I think the fact that people spoof locations and cheat on locations is really interesting. So we'll hopefully touch on all three of those topics during this talk. All right, so let me just say a couple of words about sort of the applications I have in mind, because they can kind of help us build ecosystems that are relevant. You know, if you look at the existing location services today, internet location services like a Foursquare, they just accept a user's assertion of their location. You just upload GPS coordinates. Maybe they give you an app to help you do that, but that's it. You are where you say, and that's kind of the end of the discussion. But you know what we see happening is that there's sort of this ever-growing sort of ecosystem around discounts and advertisements and things to support location services. And so I'm thinking now of the Groupons of the world. And those things are starting to increasingly incent users to report false locations because it might be some economic benefit. Spoofing your location. If you don't believe me, just go to the Android market and see how many spoofing apps you can download and pick your flavor of not telling the truth about where you are to whatever way you want. So the question that I ask is, can infrastructure help us? Infrastructure that's maybe not even in place to help us verify the precise location of a mobile user, who of course is opting in. We're not trying to find people who don't want to be found. Everybody will have to opt in. In fact, as we'll see, on a much more frequent basis if they want than it exists today. So if any conversation about any kind of location services should start with the mobile operators and the service that they offer. Look, Verizon, AT&T, wherever you are, Vodafone, they have great location services, cheap, everywhere. You can trust these companies for the most part to provide reliable services, reliable information about location. But they're a little bit handicapped in several different ways. Of course, a carrier only knows where its subscribers are. They don't know where arbitrary parties might have their phone on. It's a subscription-oriented business. So the tendency is for them to think about tracking people over long periods of time. It's even built into the services they offer. They typically offer things like friend and family watching location services because they have that kind of long-term relationship. For the most part, if you're a third party who would like to interact with a mobile operator to get information about where somebody is, even if that person agreed to be located, good luck. If these the operators are not particularly friendly to working with third parties, except when they're forced to do so. Well, something like E911, where they have a gun to their head. You must work with this party and exchange location information. There's a whole bunch of other issues of privacy and security that we won't get into. Of course, in the end, we'll get back to this at the very end, but mobile operators only locate phones, not people. They could locate people, but they currently really don't. And they have this service which is pretty good, at least down to cell towers, regardless of where you are. Usually, a lot better. Okay. So I'm thinking of an entirely different kind of model. I'm thinking now, what does a company like Groupon really need as a third party from a location service provider? So, such an organization is very much interested in locating you on a per transaction basis. Maybe you walk into a shopping mall and for some reason you are interested in obtaining some economic benefit, like a discount for a store in the mall, so you're willing to reveal where you are. But it's a one-time location exchange. It's not a tracking over time. These things should be ideally spontaneous. By spontaneous, I mean you don't have to have any relationship with anybody, a location service provider, wherever the location is determined. You shouldn't have to have any long-term or pre-existing relationship with Groupon or their advertisers, anyone like that. So just walk in, it should work. Ideally, a location authentication service should be as trustable as maybe we expect from mobile operators. And of course, privacy is paramount. So mobile users should not only opt in, but opt in on a per-use basis. Always extend that to some greater relationship if you like. But again, it's all about doing transactions. Interestingly, it would be nice if even the location service provider, whoever's figuring out where you are, whether that's a phone company, whether it's some WPS service, ideally even they should be blind to the fact that you were establishing a relationship with some remote party. You walked into a mall, you're going to get a discount from Groupon or something like that. There's no particular reason why, for example, the location service should keep a record of that interaction at all or even know anything about it, really. Okay, a flaw, if you look at lots of, and there are many existing attempts to do location authentication, we'll talk about them shortly. A real problem is that not only do these services have to be hard to defeat, but collusive attacks on location services tend to really be the killer. So we'll look more carefully on attacks that involve collusion. Again, a nice verifiable location service would have really fine-grained location information, maybe GPS level, something like that, work indoor, outdoor, be device independent, carrier independent. So this is the world we live in. This is the, what is location authentication? What would be the ideal service for Groupon today? So this is quite an impressive stack of things that we'd like to get out of the service. So let's see how far we can get. Okay. Verifying a location is not a new problem. People have been working on it at least since the early 90s. I've identified a couple of papers that are really worth looking at if you're a student, including some of Wade's work here, non-cryptographic techniques which have been in and out of popularity in the last 5 years or so. Pretty important. Some other local work, OC. And recently we're seeing some novel devices getting introduced into the picture. I'm going to talk about femtocells, and I started to see femtocell-based location services really start to be talked about around 2009, 2010, as they became more popular. If you look at what people are doing in industry, many of us here might be familiar with the WPS, Wi-Fi positioning service that Skyhook has. But what we're seeing now is there's a couple of companies that, at least, a couple of new startups that are still almost, that are trying to serve as aggregators or middlemen to, if you will, provide location services to third parties like Groupon in a carrier-independent way. So Locate or Veriplace are middlemen. They have relationships with the different carriers. So if you want to find somebody, if you will, or locate somebody, you could ask this intermediary, even if you don't know what their mobile operator is. How that works exactly is for these companies to talk through. Okay. So we'd like to build a location authentication service. So here are the players, which I'll name. So Bob is the mobile device user whose location we would like to verify. My assumption about Bob is that he will be cooperative. He'll be cooperative in the sense that maybe he's somebody's family member or employee or something like that, or interested in seeking a discount, so he's going to play along. But he's not necessarily trustworthy. He might be interested in lying to obtain some kind of economic benefit. So he might say he's where he's not, or claim to be in some place to get some benefit. On the other side of this is Alice is the party who wants to verify Bob's location. And she might in the end even be willing to pay, depending on sort of the ecosystem you build around this. And she's willing to do some work to verify Bob's location. And then the third party is really the location service provider. In this case, I'm thinking about something like a coffee shop. So Bob walks into a coffee shop. The coffee shop owner might operate an existing Wi-Fi service or something today because they have to. But they're actually interested in possibly extending this service with some kind of a sort of a public location authentication enhancement. Hopefully, perhaps because they'll be able to monetize or get some benefit out of that, possibly even ultimately to pay for this Wi-Fi and internet access service that they already offer. So, think store owner who is running a Wi-Fi who is now going to offer some kind of new and extended service. And the nice thing about this kind of public setting is the coffee shop owner doesn't really have any relationship with Alice. Never really even know who Alice is for the most part, and probably has no relationship with Bob. Bob's just some customer who walked into the store. Bob is physically present, of course. So those are the players. Now, of course, let me step back. Alice is probably someone more like Groupon, and Alice has her own business partners like advertisers or something who are willing to give discounts, possibly willing to give more discounts if Alice to prove that the people who are getting discounts are actually where they claim to be. Maybe on an individual basis or a statistical basis. And a coffee shop owner, is interested in either getting some economic benefit from providing this new service, possibly something as direct as getting paid for on a transaction basis from Alice, or something as indirect as being known as the coffee shop, in the mall where you can go and get lots of discount coupons for other service or something. All right. So the piece of the puzzle, which I think is new in terms of building an interesting location service that's not actually operated by the mobile operators, uses Femtocell. I don't know how much we know about Femtocells, but this is everything you need to know for the purposes of this talk. Think of it as a base station in a box. The range is really short, tens of meters. You can initiate calls. You can hand out calls to macro cells from Femtos, but you can't bring in calls, at least for residential Femtos today. If you have an established call from at a tower, you can't walk into your office or house with a Femtocell and bring your call into that device. There's a tiny number of users on residential Femtos, typically sort of 2 to 8-ish. Most of that is enforced because they want to, they recognize that you have limited backhaul, upstream wire, typically IP bandwidth, and since voice calls are going to consume some of that bandwidth, there's only so much bandwidth if you want to have 6 or 8 simultaneous calls. So they kind of enforce that limit, or they need to enforce that limit. At least in a residential space. We're seeing this emerging enterprise Femtocell space that I'm really interested in too, where companies are now starting to offer little boxes, access point size boxes that will support up to, say, 32 users, and they're much more sophisticated in terms of building self-organizing networks of them for enterprise apps. These things have integrated GPS. You have to have a signal lock to go. What's kind of interesting is they're pretty much exclusively talking. You pick up your phone, you associate or bind to a Femto. All the traffic is pretty much going to a security gateway for the associated mobile operator. Some traffic might go to other operator-owned points like a GPS service point. Think of basically being a tunnel. All the traffic between the Femto up into the operator network is encrypted. So we're going to snoop up that traffic in a second, but don't Don't worry about it. The people snooping on it can't really see anything. And then users have some services like being able to specify access control bus. So that location owner, if they drop one of these in their site, that's going to have some control. In this case, so we just open it up. That's all you need to know about Femtos. Okay. So this slide is the key to everything I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. So we'll spend a lot of time on it. This is sort of the most naive kind of incarnation of this system. So it's going to get, I'll keep on layering on stuff as we go on. But if we understand this, we'll understand sort of the basics of the problem in the full proposal. Now, before I do this, when I present this slide, once you come to an understanding of what it is I'm trying to say, you will feel compelled to attack the system. So just hold off for 1 second, because there's a lot of great attacks. We'll talk about them. But at least let me get through sort of an explanation of how it's going to work. And if you think of a better attack than everybody else who has heard of this and discussed attacks with me, I'll give you some kind of a prize. I want you to attack, but hold on. All right, so let's start at the bottom. So now let's start in the middle. So let's say that you are the Starbucks owner and you want to offer a location authentication service. Maybe you have an access point in place for your public Wi-Fi service. I'm going to ask you to drop a off-the-shelf Femtocell into your coffee shop. Connect it up to your access point, which goes out to your ISP. And nothing changes about this at all. I'm also going to have you drop in a box, which is a location server. I've drawn it here like it's some kind of physically separate thing, but it's actually a pretty dumb thing that is lightweight enough that it can actually either run on the access point or the Femtocell. Let's draw it separately for now. And that thing's going to do two things. It's going to be a web server and a bandwidth monitor. So that's the changes that are required for the location owner to actually operate this service. And even if location services don't, authentication doesn't help. If nothing else, the coffee shop owner can offer a new service, which is sort of indoor coverage to their coffee sippers. Okay, so Bob is the person we'd like to locate. He's going to walk into the coffee shop. He will, at this point, just have a dumb phone, not a smartphone, voice-only phone. And we'll get more sophisticated as we go. And he's going to associate with the Femtocell, which means he's within a few meters of this thing. Now, there can be other people in the coffee shop who are also using the Femto. They may have smarter dumb phones. If they are talking, perhaps they're going out through the Femto. Chances are, if they have a smartphone, they're actually doing data through the .11 AP because it's probably cheaper for them and better performing. So that's the action. The location owner has their backhaul or their ISP connection. That hasn't changed here. I've just drawn the internet with a couple of middle boxes here. The middle boxes don't serve any purpose other than I want to rule out the possibility that Alice or anybody else is going to use any traditional packet sort of network-oriented techniques to help discover what a Bob is. None of those are available to us. Okay, so if anybody calls the Femto, all the traffic is encrypted, encapsulated, goes out, comes up to the security gateway for, in this case, if Bob is making the call for Bob's provider, and then out to the rest of the world, say a voice call. So let's jump to Alice now. So Alice would like to verify that Bob is actually in this coffee shop. Alice has the equivalent of a smartphone. It doesn't have to be a smartphone. It just has to be a voice-only device and something like a web browser. But if she has a smartphone, that's fine. Now, she's not necessarily on Bob's mobile network, but her phone goes through whatever networks that connect to Bob's. Okay, the last thing is this location server and what it's doing here. The location server is looking at the bandwidth, especially the downstream bandwidth from the network to the femtocell, and just measuring the traffic that's available to it, that's traversing that link. And every second it averages the bandwidth and is going to export a stream of what's going on in that link. So this is a data stream, which is basically just the bandwidth, the downstream bandwidth on this link measured every second. So what's coming out of here, to anybody who would like to look at it, is just a stream of numbers. 100 kilobits per second, 310 kilobits per second. It's just whatever's going on. But it's encrypted, and about all we can do is measure it down. So, so we're running a web server, and here, and we're exporting this bandwidth feed to the world. And Alice is in the world, so she can take a look at both of those things. So that's the picture.
So Bob is actually one of those blue box, he's an equivalent blue box, a basic voice.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is Bob's box. This is Bob himself.
Oh,
Bob's a little green man.
But why is Alice also a voice device? Can you describe Alice as representing a service like Groupon?
Yeah, so because, that's a good question, just hold on. She won't have to be a voice. If Bob has just a dumb phone, then she's gonna actually talk. Okay. And how does this work? We'll have to bounce back and forth between this slide. So Bob binds to the femtocell. So maybe he does something like call Alice. So he's within a few meters of this box. So Bob is going to convey to Alice, and I don't care how we convey this to Alice, the URL of the location server. So basically a pointer to where he is. It says, "Hi Alice, I'm at Starbucks. Here's a URL. You can get all kinds of fine-grained information from this URL about where I'm at. Physical address, the postal address, the GPS coordinates, the owner's name, anything you want. Anything that owner is willing to broadcast." The location server is constantly monitoring the downstream bandwidth between the AP and the femto, and measuring the bandwidth each second and exporting that data stream. Alice is going to start looking at that data stream, which is available from this URL she's looking at. Okay. Alice is actually going to call Bob. This could be an entirely separate call. Alice is in control. So when she calls Bob, what she will do is effectively impress a voice traffic signature on that downstream, as she's calling Bob on that AP femto link. And she's making the call. What her call looks like, for example, when it starts, when it stops, it's really known only to her. Nobody else is controlling this. So let's go back. Okay. So Bob's maybe called Alice in this kind of really naive example, which will get more sophisticated. Said, "I'm at this URL." Alice checks the URL, is looking at the URL, hangs up on Bob, calls Bob back at some future. When her call goes to Bob, it's going to get routed to the femto, because Bob's still associated with the femto. And her traffic is going to be on this link. At the same time, this is monitoring traffic on the link, and she's watching. So she's watching her own traffic. Okay? So she's monitoring the bandwidth feed for her characteristics of her own traffic. So for example, she makes a call, she knows when it starts, she knows when it stops. So she uses that to confirm that Bob is in fact at that femtocell rather than somewhere else. So an interesting question, which I'll spend a lot of time looking at, or have spent a lot of time looking at, is how effectively Alice can convince herself that bandwidth samples for encrypted traffic traversing that ingress into the femtocell is in fact her own traffic.
This is quite fascinating. So if I understood you correctly, you're using the methods that you usually use break anonymity systems to provide.
Right. So if I was talking to a different audience, I'd say we're using this sort of network sidechain to, with a return to provide sort of hidden information about what's.
So why not just send a special message?
So if I was the, this is a great question, so let's get back to that at the end. If I could control the operator network, I would do that. If I was the operator and I wanted to offer a service like that, so I would do that. But I'm trying to essentially use operator infrastructure, local operator infrastructure, without asking them to change anything. If they were going to be helpful and change some things, there's a whole bunch of things that I would probably ask them to do. So we'll get back to that. That's a great question.
So just to understand properly, you're monitoring the sum of all the traffic.
Yeah,
right?
right, that's perfect. So here we go. Thank you. Okay, so what does a voice call look like? These are not, voice calls are encoded using all kinds of different algorithms that are selected by whoever that mobile operator is. And they're not necessarily as smart as you think. So it turns out that in my Verizon 3G case, a call looks very much like, on that length, looks very much like a more or less constant 50 or so kilobit per second continuous duplex up and down for the different directions of the voice traffic signal. So this is an 11-second call. It's not precise because in part I'm taking bandwidth samples every second or so, averaging the bandwidth. So this is what Alice is actually seeing. You know, she's listening, she sees a little bit of noise. Maybe she's actually drawing this, I mean, visualizing this. That would just be a convenience rather than something we would base a decision on. You know, she picks up the phone, rings Bob, you know, and then a couple of seconds after Bob picks up, because it takes a long time to see the traffic go through the network, all of a sudden she sees a bounce in the return bandwidth feed to her, which is kind of consistent with her initiating the call, and then she hangs up, and then she sees the traffic drop off. So voice calls have a very well-defined signal. Okay, so now to Yvonne's question. So, you know, how can Alice design a signal on a shared channel where on that shared channel there are other users, although not too many users typically, who might be simultaneously sending text, their own voice calls, some data traffic. So how do you design such a signal? You know, what should be sort of the characteristics of the signal? This is a fun research problem that should look familiar to many of you. So, you know, so we're sort of inspired now by, let me just go back for those who didn't catch it all, Yvonne's question. So these guys are all doing something, these other people, not too many of them because there's a limit to how many people can simultaneously use this, are all doing stuff. Some of them may be doing stuff that's causing traffic to come to them. So we're actually seeing the aggregate bandwidth, and we're measuring the aggregate bandwidth, not just the bandwidth to Bob. So now we have to, Alice has to figure out from that aggregate whether her signal is actually embedded. So, you know, this looks a lot like the classical communication theory types of detection problems, where, you know, this might look, you know, familiar to you, like analogies to things like pulse width modulation and detecting signals like that. So we can use the same sort of techniques, although the problem is a little bit complicated because the noise is a little bit more complicated with the interferent traffic. But we can look at things like the continuity of data. I should say Alice is looking at these when she's trying to determine, you know, sort of evaluate a hypothesis that in fact her call is actually on this particular link. We can look for edges because we know the shape of these signals. And we can look at timing, and we can do things like correlations and things of that sort. So you can put together a bunch of heuristics and actually process the signal and make a determination about whether Alice's call is actually present or not under the right conditions of noise. Okay. So if you're interested in an analytical problem, you can extract one easily enough from this. So you could make a case, for example, that the noise on this channel, now it's unknown noise because text traffic looks like one thing, data traffic, web type traffic typically looks like another thing. Text messages, picture messages, they all look different. They're all over the place. And they vary incredibly in size, as we'll talk about in a second, which is kind of the flaw of this whole approach. But I mean, one interesting model I did put together was going back, looking at this as something like shot noise, which you can dig out of your sort of probability textbooks and communication textbooks. So shot noise is, a model of it is when we have something like a known noise instance, which I'll call H, and we have something like an impulse train, a train of delta functions hitting a linear filter and generating these bursts of potentially time overlapping noise. So we can think about not just a single instance of some interfering traffic, but lots of different people contributing to interfering traffic. And in some cases, the bandwidth of their interfering traffic is sort of adding because they're overlapping in time. So we can be, the background interfering traffic on this channel that Alice is trying to, resolve her signal from can be all over the place. There could be nothing, the universe, depending on what the sort of component traffic is. So you can go down this kind of path and come up with things like distribution functions and evaluate, or at least I say estimate probabilities that Alice won't be able to detect her signal. And remember, Alice can keep on retrying. There's nothing really stopping. As long as Bob is there, she really has no time limit on what it is she's doing. So even if she is not able to confirm Bob's presence with a single voice call, then she may be retrying again, and hopefully sort of misencountering a little bit. I'm going to stop and ask if there's any questions that are not attacks from the system, and then we'll keep on going.
Missing something, so how do you get back this rate monitoring feed? Why should the Femtocell provide that to you?
It's a publicly exported stream that anybody can tap into.
But is that something that you normally have, or?
Well, so
What's the what is the distribution of these services? So the access point owner is the coffee shop guy.
this is the coffee shop guy.
So what makes him put this thing in? Which is the experience?
Alice will pay for the service. Alice will
so-
give him a nickel.
Yeah, but if Alice does that, Alice might as well just put in a challenge response system with this address. This I assume is of more general value to the location owner.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what your question is, but why should he do it?
But why should he export bandwidth? It seems like kind of an unusual thing to be exporting.
Of course it is, but it's a
It does allow other people to do kind of traffic analysis on your network.
well, it does. We'll eventually talk about sort of the location, security and privacy aspects of exporting a bandwidth stream. But if you think about it, there's not really that much information in what's going on here.
It's okay, I'm just trying to see what your
Yeah.
motivation was.
Well, okay, so my motivation is the coffee shop owner would like to offer a new service beyond just Wi-Fi. So we're trying to sort of monetize Wi-Fi here. The service will be authenticating the location of people who walk in off the street. Ultimately they will receive some benefit from these other parties by offering, maybe an indirect benefit, by offering the service. And all they have to do is drop in a femtocell, which is almost free, and run a web server. And from that web server, just have this exported data stream, which is a few bytes per second of exported data. So spinning it out.
Proof, though, that Alice gets, or the evidence that Alice gets that Bob is there, is that the use of bandwidth changes on the link.
And
Rather than Bob answers the phone and says something, rather than some response.
The location
data
server
by Bob.
could be running the challenge response system instead.
No, but the problem is the service provider.
Why?
how are you going to push the challenge response to the service provider if you don't know
The
it?
service provider doesn't
No one advanced what?
Who is your service
Is
provider?
the issue.
service provider doesn't care, I think.
No, but how am I going to push
If the
stuff?
location owner
Has
is
a phone number.
Okay, I mean, I'm just trying to,
No, no, no.
this I can see the kind of a weak feedback that you're getting, and maybe less controversial than running keys.
No, no.
Yeah, well, this is the most naive system. I'm not suggesting we're not going to add things to it.
No, no. Keep in mind that both service provider and the Femtocell are not under Alice's control by any means. You can't inject anything in there. There is nothing for you to do there. Verizon owns it.
No, but somebody is
somebody else-
forcing him to send that red arrow back, right? I mean, he
No, no,
says
but
that-
Alice gives you the red arrow. Alice controls the yellow box on the right hand side. That's the only thing she controls.
Sure, so why doesn't he put more complicated stuff? in
How?
there?
You can't own service provider network and you can't own the
Okay,
Femtocell.
I get it, but I'm saying that this is a very simple feedback that you're giving.
I mean, the assumption is, I know why it's simple, because you want to just observe externality and not get into the devices that.
But could it be even more simpler? So, how about just return routeability test on packet level? So, what will go wrong if, let's
It's
say...
encrypted channel. You can't observe the traffic on that link.
No, but do you need to... So,
You can't. You can't see any traffic, or you can't look at the data from the Femtocell to service provider. You can't.
Does Ivan have it right?
So, yeah, Yvonne has it right, but there's also a good point here, which is a lot of people are trying to change what information Alice can send to Bob. And we're going to do that in the rest of the talk.
no.
The reason why we're limited right now is because Bob only has a dumb phone. I'm not assuming he has anything else.
Okay.
So the smarter Bob is, then we can begin to layer on stuff like keys and challenge responses and things like that. So this is the sort of the most naive version. And I think the point that Yvonne is kind of getting to is we don't have control of anything. About the only thing we can do, the only sort of exchange that Alice and Bob can trivially make today is this sort of manual voice call. Under these circumstances, and as we give them more power, they can do some more things. But again, so at some point, if you have the assistance of the network, which we're not assuming we have the assistance of at all, you can do even more things. So we'll get.
Voice authentication protocol on Alice's side.
You mean because we can hear Bob?
Just to voice.
You can hear Bob behind the curtains. So Bob can have some,
But you're
even
doing a call back, right?
well, okay, Alice is calling Bob as part of this verification. She can certainly talk to Bob. Ultimately, we'd like to, sort of not use voice and not do anything manually here, but let's just get started with this. But Bob, Bob can even attack the system. So just the presence of Bob's voice at the other end of the call, even in this case, if Alice knows Bob, it's not telling her what it is. Okay, let's keep going. Okay. All right, so there's kind of a fun signal detection problem here with this new kind of noise thing, which is aggregated traffics of different types. So let me just give you a little information about what these different traffics look like, and I'm sure this is no news to you. You look at text messages are almost no content. So this is an example. If I was to take 40, kind of an emulated example, simulated example, if I took 40 text messages that occurred at random times in a 30-second interval with a voice call, and the voice call is in blue, then what Alice would see would look like would look like the grid. She'd still be able to easily recognize the fact that the voice call is there, because 40 text messages are, trivial background traffic. The text messages are I'm going to skip a text. I don't have an example of interfering voice calls, but let me go back. If there are simultaneous voice calls in the same epoch that you're trying to observe your own signal, How effectively Alice can determine that it's her call versus somebody else's call, when there are multiple calls going on, depends entirely on the timing of the interference of those calls. In some cases they're additive, in some cases they're partly overlapping, in some cases they're such wildly different durations that it's easy for us to detect the presence of her call, because she's basically looking for edges. She can control the timing of those things. So interfering voice calls are tricky, but for the most part not overwhelming if we can keep them, particularly if she can keep on retrying. And I have all kinds of examples of interfering voice calls. Data is an entirely different question. If any of the people on that network are sharing the Femtocell, along with are downloading data, these data signals are massive compared to the, if you will, the magnitude of the voice bandwidth. I give some examples here. These were taken a long time ago with a really bad smartphone. And you see that if you just do hits on the main web pages for different kinds of web services like ESPN, which is a lot of content, you'll see hundreds of kilobits of traffic, in fairly short bursts, and no two web pages look the same. So that's sort of the interferent traffic that we will eventually be trying to detect a tiny voice signal. Now remember, voice signals could be of much longer duration than any particular web download, but there can be many of these per happening in a network. All right. If you actually get a modern smartphone, you can pretty much saturate a 3G channel. So here we have pushing 2 megabits of bursts of data if you're hitting NFL.com on a powerful enough 3G. And as you can imagine, if we were to rerun this on 4G, you have exactly the same thing, but it's 10 times. The data is 10 times bigger. The voice is exactly the same size as it was before. So the problem of, even though voice signals are detectable, the problem of detecting them is just getting harder and harder and harder as the size of the interfering traffic grows and the number of users on the Femtocell grows. So we probably want to kind of give up on using voice calls as the signals. So let's kind of move on, because it's an interesting problem, but it's not reliable. However, I don't think that there really are any effective ways that are out there in the open literature to locate or authenticate the location of a basic voice-only phone.
What was it? There was a microphone in that box you attached.
Yeah, there's all kinds of.
And here's the voice, and he speaks into the phone.
There's all kinds of challenge response queues and hardware and stuff that can and people have suggested work. There's all kinds of things. So, microphones, cameras, actions. That never has. Okay, so the natural thought is, well, why don't we just back off and say, now let's pretend that Bob has a smartphone. If Bob has a smartphone, we'll be able to do interesting things. The most interesting thing we'll be able to do is have Alice use data as a vehicle to communicate with Bob. So Alice will create a data signature, a voice signature, and Alice can make her data signature as big as she wants. So she can compete with the other folks in the channel and increase her, if you will, reliability to be able to detect her own signal. Okay. So now let's replay things. This is almost the same thing, except what we're doing is we're saying that instead of Alice actually making a voice call to Bob to impress her signal on this link, she's going to have some data source, and I just described this as a web server, and she's going to be able to control the output of her web server. So maybe she'll be able to do rate control. She can control some stuff. Bob now has a smartphone, and so he can receive data. Now, a little bit different is if we wanted to just rate control data, as is something I have investigated, we would use the same mechanism where just the bandwidth would be measured every second and exported to anybody who's interested in looking at it. But in fact, we can now sort of increase the amount of information we send in this feedback channel describing what's going on in that line. So one of the things that we'll ultimately want to describe is not just the level of the bandwidth in a 1 second interval, but the packet sizes that we're observing. It's one of the few things that we can control.
So for this picture, I'd like to ask my question again. So why wouldn't the return routability test work? So I assume you need to have some sort of activity that's set up here. So how about if Alice knows the IP addresses of the 802.11 access point here, and they map the traffic of the smartphones, and then when you access it from there, you know that it needs to be in the network at least if they respond to the queries from Alice.
So I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind, but I'm putting middle boxes here to prevent other sort of mechanisms that Alice might be using to locate anything here. I'm just kind of trying to exclude them from discussion, but they clearly exist as alternate means that Alice can attempt to find. Wow.
I can give you one example. Typically, femtocells are all tunnel. So you won't see the femtocell traffic. You won't expose any of the path other than the service provider core network gateway.
Yeah, things are actually getting pretty complicated based on what the service provider is doing.
You know, in other words, if you take your phone on the femtocell, you will what's my IP will always show the Verizon gateway as your IP.
Okay, so Starbucks won't have their...
Exactly. You won't be routed through the Starbucks network.
That is one of the complications. Any traffic back to Alice will look like it's from here.
Exactly. The only difference in this particular case is 802.11, right? Maybe, but that's where your middle box.
I'm trying to exclude. There are all kinds of other ways that we can get at it. I'm just trying to say let's not worry about it.
But even that is not necessarily going to work even in case of Starbucks. Starbucks does a similar thing. In other words, if it's one of those, what's the name of the large network that works throughout the airports? Boingo, right? They will not expose their internal routing structure at all. So you'll again see it as some gateways.
Okay, so I'm going to have to jump ahead because we're going a little slow. But so the whole idea here is if Alice can now send data traffic to find Bob, she can send an arbitrary, as much as she wants. Kind of enough such that her signal will actually be detectable. Her data traffic signal for signature will be detectable here, even if there are other folks sharing this link, other folks down here sharing this link. So basically I'm just trying to increase the size. So that Alice pushes to Bob as part of the traffic. So that's good, and you can do that, and I spent a lot of time doing that. But you probably don't want to do that in the end anyway. So what I found, just jumping to the conclusion, is that there's not much you can control because of this encrypted, encapsulated, operator routed stuff. And they do things that we have to kind of run the operators. So what you can control is the amount of traffic that you push, although you have to be careful that what you push and what actually gets there are identical. It gets changed in the network because of doing costs. That's okay. But you can accurately control the size of packets that you're pushing. And if you actually look at a typical push, typical transfer, it's exactly what you think. So this is a transfer now from Alice's web server, 200 byte file. She's not doing anything to it. You can think of Bob just doing a get, and this is what the bandwidth would look like on that downlink. And this is what the packet size is. So what you observe is what you expect. You wouldn't even call it bimodal. It's bimodal distribution where all the data is in big packets, And then there's a little background stuff going on, which are hacks and possibly voice interferent voice packets and control packets and stuff. But basically, there's nothing happening in the middle. So Alice is going to try to jump on packet sizes in the middle, send them to Bob, get the feedback about packet sizes on that link, and then conclude that, boy, nobody sends odd packet sizes at mid-size in a particular sequence that I'm sending, and that'll be my signature. So how does that work? Well, here's the same traffic if Alice starts to play some games on it. Just so she's going to limit effectively her MTU on her web server to 512, which wouldn't be a good choice in this particular example. And she's going to do rate control, so she will, even though she's sending a 200K kilobyte file, maybe she'll pick a number like 100 kilobits per second. So she can now look at both the bandwidth and the size of the packets on that line that are fed back to her in that return data feed. And what she would see is that all the traffic that used to be up here in big packet sizes, which actually represents real data in the payload of the packets, has now actually been replaced with twice as many packets that essentially have size. So if Alice is looking at this link, she can pick numbers of sizes of packets in the middle, like in this case 512, but when it's encrypted and encapsulated, it blows up to 590. And nobody's sending packets that happen to be this odd size, 500 bytes. She sees all of a sudden I send data, I push data. All of a sudden there's a burst that corresponds to what I sent. It must be me sending traffic. Femto, so Bob must read.
So this box in the middle, the traffic box, is able to measure the sizes of the packets. Go to that link. Is it clearly?
Yeah, let's go back. This is doing something that doesn't even have to be as heavy as a TCP dump. I don't even use TCP dump normally to do this, but I use even simpler tools lots of time to measure bandwidth. I have stack. So now it's just looking at packet sizes. It can't see anything about the packets that are encrypted. So it might see in 1 second a burst of 20 packets, and those 20 packets have different sizes, whatever weird sizes they happen to be, and that vector of tuple, the sizes of the 20 packets gets sent out.
But somehow the encryption or the tunneling or whatever it's going to do doesn't somehow screw around with the packet size?
Well, it does. I mean, like, if we go back, but actually it's usually pretty helpful rather than hurtful. So when we go back here, Alice is actually really, if you look at it in the next example, she's sending packets where the MTU is 512. They're actually 512 when they leave her. They get encrypted and encapsulated going through the mobile operator network. Arrive to the femto before they get decapsulated are 590. But that mapping is deterministic. What you might worry about is what if Alice is sending really big packets that could get fragmented or anything like that. And that's exactly what we tell her not to do. Don't do that. So it's true that the packets arriving are not the same, but they're easily recognized.
So this data just for this purpose? So you kind of waste bandwidth for using?
If you would like to do something useful with that 200 kbytes, do something useful with it, but it's kind of an insignificant amount to do. Now, in fact, this happened so quick. I mean, Alice, within a fraction of a second should be able to determine that. If only, I never see this size packets on these links. Basically, the next, if you will, the next n-tuple the packet size that she sees, she'll know immediately. It must be me, because this link never sees sizes of this sort. Okay, so we have to dig in from here. We have to design signals. We have to. We haven't even built out the system to things like, well, they both have smartphones, and now maybe on top of this we should be using keys and things to actually harden it. We're still at the point, for example, where we're only finding the phone. But if we do a key exchange on top of something first, then we're actually finding the person. If you accept the premise that the people please, and we can get arbitrary. So this is a low-level traffic level location authentication component to possibly a much more complex system. Okay, now everybody's been great. Nobody's jumped all over all the different ways to attack this. There can be plenty. Let me just jump ahead because it'll take too much time to actually tear this apart. Okay, so there's at least 3 things that I'm worried about. This is kind of a simple table. I'm worried about loss of privacy of any of the participants in this. I'm worried about disrupting the operation of the system, and I'm worried about deceiving the verifier. So there's all kinds of different security breaches and concerns we should be concerned with. So I think Ray was asking earlier, for example, look at loss of privacy. Anybody in the world can observe this data. So there's some information in the data feed. I don't think there's a whole heck of a lot, but so there's some loss of privacy. So maybe, for example, if the data feed always suggests that there's a lot of traffic, then the coffee shop competitors could say, I see so much data all the time, on this guy's Femtocell link, so much data being used that he must have a great coffee shop. And I want to build another great coffee shop down the street. I mean, there's some information in that chat. There's not much. As usual, you can compromise any of the devices in the system, and that's really hard to do. Yeah. Compromise Alice's web service. In terms of disrupting the system, we're no different from almost any internet type service. That denial of service attacks are easy. They can be even from inside the coffee shop, if you will. There's all kinds of ways to deny service. Remember, the location owner itself can just say, I don't want to authenticate anybody's location today and turn off this Femtocell. There's a million different attacks. There's problems with saturating the bandwidth. That's an easy attack. For example, on that link, you can sit in a coffee shop, sit there downloading NFL.com all day, and nobody's really going to be able to authenticate. Certainly, the voice-only phone. Again, we can compromise devices and disrupt the system. The coolest attacks and the most fun are always the how do we deceive the verifier? In this case, how did Bob deceive Alice? So now we get into sort of a discussion of what resources Bob has available. And of course, that has to be balanced against the fact that any attack has to sort of be in real time. It has to be not particularly costly compared to the benefit of Bob and all these other caveats. So let me jump all the way to the end and say that attacks that are the trickiest, but not necessarily particularly great, are attacks that involve people walking around with their own private bogus femtocells, which is doable, although tricky. Most of these attacks are pretty tricky. Bob could drop a femtocell in this room and say, I'm anywhere. And Alice can call him, and he'd use his own femtocell, get a link out, and Alice would say, well, I run a fake web server. And Alice would say, well, I think Bob is where he says he is, because his traffic is going to where he says he is, and I trust that location open. The problem with an attack like that is always it'll work. The problem is that it's really not a sustainable attack. Bob can't continuously deceive Alice. Alice can call back in 2 hours. Alice can call back in a week. Alice can keep track of all the data feed URLs she's ever gotten from Bob and look at them all at once to see if there are any games going on. So there are a whole bunch of attacks that are kind of one-off kind of attacks that work, that don't sustain themselves over time. there's a whole bunch of attacks, as is true in all these location authentication systems that involve some kind of on-site collusion. You send your friend to where you're supposed to be. That friend has equipment out to see Alice that you were in fact getting the call, and maybe your friend has the logical equivalent of your phone. And these attacks tend to be pretty tricky, but somewhat doable. And recall that Alice can keep on trying, and she can have proxies keep on trying. So they tend to be a little bit trickier to implement than you might think, but nonetheless they do work. So I think I'll stop. I'll just say that maybe we'll just give up on trying to authenticate the location of devices that are not smart. I don't know. It's an interesting problem. Nobody's really looking at it. But it still represents 2/3 of phones for them, right, roughly. And the problem is that this problem is getting important. So I don't have any great solution other than what I presented. Absolutely the simplest thing to do is for locating a smartphone is pushing data of different sizes to it and getting an ID. And it works pretty good as far as I can tell. And then in terms of what's going on in the rest of the world, I'm watching these guys carefully, these Where 2.0 middlemen and locateds and Vivero places who claim to be playing this middleman role between third parties and operators because they're attempting to solve exactly the same problem. So we'll have to see how that goes. I have real questions about whether they can make that model work, but it's the right place to attack. So I'll stop. Thanks for having me. We'll take questions.